I am Clara Hayes. 18 months ago, I stood in the center of my life and watched it vanish. It was not a sudden robbery or a smash and grab. It was a systematic extraction. Millions in proprietary code, years of sleepless nights, and the patents that defined my future were siphoned away, commit by commit. My husband stood in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the screen, unaware that I was watching him steal the foundation of my existence. I did not scream. I did not call the police. I did not even raise my voice. I simply watched, I waited, and then I began to calculate the cost of his ambition. To understand how I dismantled everything they built, you have to understand the nature of the silence I occupied. I was not a victim in that moment. I was an observer. I let them believe they were the architects of my ruin, while I was already busy laying the trap. Every line of code they stole became a wire in the snare. The game had begun, and they had no idea that the rules were written in my hand. Before the betrayal, there was only the work. My world was a small apartment that smelled constantly of burnt coffee and hot solder. Whiteboards covered every wall, acting as maps for systems that did not yet exist. I spent weeks in that room, hunched over terminals, chasing logic through the dark. Every line of code was a claim on the future, a deliberate strike against the limitations of current technology. I lived on caffeine and the hum of cooling fans. My hands were often stained with flux and my eyes burned from the flicker of the screens. It was a life of total isolation, but it was mine. Then, the first contract arrived. I remember the weight of the envelope on the kitchen counter. I opened it, read the terms, and sat down on the floor. I did not cry because of the money. I wept because the validation was absolute. Someone else had seen the architecture of my mind and decided it was worth building. I had no idea then that this success would become the very target that drew them in. Success brought a strange, hollow quiet to my apartment. I had the contract, but I had no one to share the weight of the work. Then David arrived. He did not come as a stranger. He appeared as the perfect patch for my loneliness. He was attentive, persistent, and possessed an uncanny ability to show up exactly when the code refused to compile. He sat on the edge of my desk, watching the terminal, asking questions that actually made sense. He did not just listen, he engaged. He spoke in the language of algorithms and system architecture, mirroring my own thoughts back to me with surgical precision. It was intoxicating. He made me feel seen in a way that no client or peer ever had. He brought food, he cleared the clutter from my workspace, and he insisted on understanding the core logic behind my predictive systems. I let him in, I opened the files, I explained the proprietary structures, I watched him absorb the data with an intensity that I mistook for genuine interest. I did not see the pattern he was building. The transition from my quiet apartment to their world was abrupt. David brought me to their home, a place of sharp angles and glass walls that overlooked the city. Beatrice and Chloe were waiting. Beatrice moved through the space with a calculated, heavy authority, while Chloe watched me with the restless energy of a hunter. We gathered at a long, transparent table that felt more like a laboratory bench than a dining surface. The conversation started with pleasantries, but it did not last. Within minutes, the focus shifted entirely to my predictive systems. Chloe began asking about scalability, her questions precise and relentless. She was not interested in the logic. She was interested in the yield. Beatrice leaned in, her gaze fixed on the tablet where I had opened my core architecture. They did not treat the code as an achievement. They treated it as a raw material to be processed. I watched them pick through my algorithms, identifying modules and estimating market value with a speed that made my pulse quicken. The air in the room grew thin. I had come expecting a family connection, but I found myself in the middle of a business audit. Every time I tried to steer the conversation back to the human element, they circled back to the data. They were not looking at me. They were looking through me, calculating the potential of the work I had built. I sat there, surrounded by their ambition, realizing that I was no longer the guest. I was the inventory. The first cracks appeared in the ledger. A licensing fee from a mid-sized firm failed to reconcile. A payment from a primary client vanished into a pending status that never cleared. I spent 3 nights tracing the flow of funds, mapping every transaction against the projected revenue. The math did not hold. Money was leaking out of the system, siphoned away in small, precise increments that looked like rounding errors. I brought the discrepancies to David. I laid out the spreadsheets, pointing to the gaps in the deposit history. He did not look at the numbers. He looked at me, a soft, indulgent smile playing on his lips. He touched my shoulder and told me I was simply exhausted. He called it a glitch in my focus, not a glitch in the accounts. I felt the familiar weight of doubt settle in my chest. But the numbers remained, cold and unyielding on the screen. The house was silent, save for the hum of the server rack in the corner of my office. It was well past midnight. I was running a diagnostic on the core kernel, looking for the source of the financial errors that David insisted were imaginary. I opened the process monitor, scanning the background tasks that usually sat idle while I slept. That was when I saw it. A thread I had not written, buried deep within the architecture, was active. It was small, efficient, and masked by a recursive loop. I tried to terminate it, but the command bounced back with an access denied error. My heart rate stayed steady, but my focus sharpened. I bypassed the standard interface, diving into the raw hex code to see where the data was being routed. It was an encrypted exfiltration path. The code was not just leaking, it was being harvested. Every line I perfected, every breakthrough I documented was being copied. I sat back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, and finally understood. They were stealing my future, one line of code at a time. Panic did not come. Instead, a sudden, biting cold settled over my thoughts. The fear of being robbed evaporated, replaced by a crystalline clarity that turned the world into a series of predictable inputs and outputs. I did not reach for the phone. I did not wake David. I simply pulled a fresh drive from the cabinet and initialized a shadow mirror. My hands moved with mechanical precision, configuring the system to intercept the exfiltration stream without alerting the ghost process. I began to log every packet, every function, and every line of stolen logic as it traveled through the encrypted tunnel. I watched the data flow, tagging each piece of code with a digital timestamp that would serve as an immutable record of their greed. I traced the destination, following the breadcrumbs through a labyrinth of proxy servers and masked nodes. I kept the monitor brightness low, the room dark, and my breathing rhythmic. I was no longer just a developer, I was an auditor of their betrayal. I followed the data stream through a final, poorly configured node. The encryption peeled away, revealing the destination of my stolen life's work. It was not a competitor or a faceless entity. It was a shell company, registered under a name that sounded like a generic holding firm, but the digital footprint was unmistakable. I pulled up the registration records, my fingers flying across the keys. The company was tied to a series of offshore accounts, all of which traced back to a single point of origin, Chloe. The realization hit me with the weight of a physical blow. This was not just David siphoning off a few extra dollars. This was a family operation. I dug deeper, finding the link between Chloe's venture capital firm and the shell company's ledger. Every stolen algorithm, every proprietary function I had spent months refining was being funneled directly into her portfolio. I sat back, the screen casting a harsh white light over my desk. The betrayal was complete, coordinated, and absolute. Beatrice's influence was written into the legal structure, and David was the one providing the access. They were not just taking my code, they were building an empire on the foundation of my silence. I closed the file, my jaw set, and stared at the dark window. The game had changed. I was no longer fighting a thief, I was fighting a syndicate. The transition was seamless. I closed the investigation files, wiped the temporary logs, and stood up to meet them. When David walked through the door, I did not look at him with suspicion. I looked at him with the practiced, soft gaze of a partner who knew nothing. I began to feed them exactly what they wanted. I curated the data streams, injecting flawed but convincing code snippets that appeared like breakthrough innovations. I watched them consume it. At dinner, I sat at the glass-walled table and listened to their talk of valuation and market dominance. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my expression neutral, and my voice steady. When Chloe asked about the latest algorithm, I offered a technical explanation that was just complex enough to satisfy her, but hollow enough to keep my real work safe. I played the part of the supportive wife, nodding as David spoke of his vision for the company. Every nod was a calculated move. I ensured the data they siphoned was consistent, feeding their greed while I remained invisible. They believed they were the ones in control. I waited for the right moment, when the wine had loosened their guard and their hunger for more was at its peak. I stood at the head of the table and laid out the proposal. I spoke of a centralized holding company, a structure designed to consolidate our assets and maximize our reach. I used the words they craved, like oxygen, valuation, scale, and exit multiples. I watched their eyes sharpen. Chloe leaned forward, her fingers tapping against the glass surface, calculating the potential for her own portfolio. Beatrice stopped mid-sentence, her attention shifting entirely to the promise of institutional growth. I painted a picture of a unified empire, a machine that would turn their current gains into a dominant market force. They did not see the cage. They saw a throne. David looked at me with a mix of surprise and pride, clearly convinced that I was finally playing the game his way. He signaled his approval, and the others followed, their voices overlapping in a chorus of agreement. The pitch was perfect. The trap was set. The final document arrived on my desk the next morning. It was a thick stack of paper, heavy with the weight of their future and my design. I spent hours drafting the language, ensuring every word served a singular purpose. I buried the clause deep within the boilerplate, hidden under the dry, technical heading of asset provenance and indemnification. It stated clearly that any asset proven to be stolen or misappropriated would trigger an immediate, total reversion of all linked accounts, properties, and investments back to the original creator. I called it a cross-collateralization measure, a standard safeguard for high-value mergers. I walked them through the pages, pointing out the sections on tax efficiency and liability shielding, while gliding over the mechanism of their ruin. I watched their eyes scan the text, skimming past the dense paragraphs of legal jargon that would eventually strip them of everything. They were looking for profit, not pitfalls. I handed the pen to David, my hand steady, my pulse slow. He took it without hesitation. I watched the ink hit the paper. The conference table was cleared of everything but the contract and a single gold-plated pen. Beatrice sat at the head, her fingers drumming a steady rhythm against the mahogany. She paused, squinting at the final page, and for a heartbeat, the room went still. She asked for a clarification on the signature block, her voice sharp with the need for control. I leaned in, explained the formality with a practiced, calm tone, and watched her frustration dissolve into impatience. She did not look at the clauses. She looked at the signature line. She signed with a flourish, the ink dark and absolute. Chloe followed, her eyes already darting toward the window, visualizing the scale of the expansion she believed was hers. David was the last. He held the pen for a moment, looking at me with a smile that was meant to be reassuring, but only revealed his total ignorance. He signed. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the loudest thing in the room. They passed the folder back to me, their faces bright with the thrill of a deal. They toasted to the future, their glasses clinking in the quiet office. They were celebrating the start of their empire, oblivious to the fact that they had just authorized its liquidation. I took the folder, closed it, and felt the weight of their ruin in my hands. The months that followed were a study in calculated patience. I sat in my office, watching the data flow through the channels I had mapped out for them. They moved with the frantic energy of people who believed they had finally arrived. Chloe began deploying the algorithms, pushing updates to the market. She did not. She was merely turning the keys to a machine I had built to eventually stall. Beatrice leveraged the initial valuation spikes to secure prime real estate, her signature appearing on deeds and contracts that were now tied directly to my hidden reversion clause. David became the face of the operation, giving interviews where he spoke of proprietary breakthroughs that were nothing more than my discarded drafts. I watched the numbers climb on my monitors, a steady, rhythmic pulse of their growing greed. Every commit they pushed, every deal they closed, was a brick added to a cage. I kept my distance, playing the role of the silent, supportive partner, while my shadow system logged every transaction. They were convinced they were the architects of a new era, unaware that every step they took was bringing them closer to the moment I would pull the floor out from under them. The headlines arrived in a steady, predictable rhythm. Chloe was everywhere. Tech journals hailed her as a generational talent, a visionary who had cracked the code to predictive market behavior. I watched from my desk as she took the stage at the Global Innovation Summit. The lights were blinding, the crowd was hushed, and she stood before a massive screen displaying my work. A journalist asked a pointed question about the underlying neural architecture. Chloe faltered, her smile tightening for a fraction of a second, before she pivoted to vague, high-level buzzwords. She didn't need to understand the logic. The system was running perfectly, processing millions of transactions in real time. The audience erupted in applause as the live demo showed a flawless, high-speed output. She accepted the praise with a practiced grace, oblivious to the fact that she was merely a passenger in a vehicle I had programmed to crash. Every interview she gave, every award she accepted, and every feature article that praised her brilliance was another layer of evidence. I logged into my archive. While Chloe courted the media, Beatrice moved with a different kind of hunger. She saw the rising valuation of the software not as a product, but as a lever. She began acquiring luxury properties across the city, using the tech company's inflated balance sheet as collateral. I watched the bank filings hit my screen in real time. She was aggressive, buying up historic brownstones and commercial blocks, convinced that the growth was infinite. She treated the code like a bottomless well of credit. I tracked every loan document, every property deed, and every financial instrument she signed. She was effectively tethering her entire real estate empire to the stolen algorithms. If the software failed, the collateral would vanish, and the banks would come for the assets. She didn't realize that the valuation she relied on was a mirage I had carefully calibrated. I spent my nights cross-referencing her acquisitions with the reversion clauses buried in our holding company agreement. Every new building she added to her portfolio was another piece of the puzzle that would eventually fall into my hands. She was building a kingdom on a foundation of sand, and she was doing it with such confidence that she never bothered to check the fine print of the agreements she signed. She was the perfect partner in her own undoing, meticulously gathering the wealth that would soon be legally stripped away. David was the final piece of the architecture. He stopped playing the supportive husband and started performing the role of a tech titan. During executive strategy meetings, he would stand at the head of the table, gesturing at the data streams I had built, and describe them as his own proprietary breakthroughs. He spoke of algorithms as if he had spent years in the trenches of code, his voice dripping with an unearned authority. I sat in the corner, silent, taking notes on his performance. When I once attempted to offer a technical correction regarding a latency issue, he cut me off with a patronizing laugh, dismissing my input as outdated. He was so intoxicated by the projected valuation of the company that he stopped looking over his shoulder. He began signing off on high-risk market maneuvers, convinced that his genius, or rather, the genius he had stolen, was infallible. He was building his reputation on a foundation of my work, and he was doing it with a reckless, swaggering confidence that made my skin crawl. Every time he claimed a strategy as his own, he was documenting his own fraud. He was so focused on the incoming buyout that he didn't notice the trap closing around him. He thought he was the architect of a new empire, but he was merely the final, arrogant variable in my equation. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, marked with the high-priority seal of a global venture firm. $50 million. The offer to acquire Chloe's company was finally on the table. I watched the notification pop up on the shared server, the digital equivalent of a fuse being lit. Within minutes, the house was alive with the sound of celebration. Chloe was pacing the living room, already calculating the prestige of the exit, while David poured expensive scotch, his hands steady. They were talking about the future, about what they would buy and where they would go, their voices thick with arrogance. They didn't see me standing in the doorway, watching the data flow. They were so blinded by the $50 million figure. The clause I had buried 18 months ago was now active. By accepting this offer, they were triggering a formal transfer. I felt the cold, sharp clarity of a trap finally snapping shut. The game was over, and they had not even realized they were playing. I retreated to my office, closing the door on their hollow celebrations. The room was quiet, lit only by the steady pulse of my monitors. I pulled up the shadow system, the hidden architecture I had spent 18 months perfecting. On the screen, the buyout funds hit the primary account, and the trigger fired. I watched the blast radius of their greed expand in real time. The cross-collateralization clause, executed with surgical precision, locking every asset tied to the stolen code. I tracked the movement of capital as it was frozen, redirected, and tagged for reclamation. Beatrice's real estate holdings were the first to go, the digital lien snapping into place like iron bars. Chloe's venture stakes followed, the ownership records shifting back to my control. I didn't feel triumph. I felt the satisfaction of a perfect calculation. I opened the final audit log and began the export. They had built their entire empire on a foundation of sand, and I had just pulled the tide in. The trap was fully engaged. The invitations went out by noon, printed on heavy cardstock with gold leaf edges. Chloe insisted on the rooftop venue, a glass-walled space overlooking the city, perfectly suited for the announcement of their $50 million exit. I watched from the hallway as they debated the guest list, their voices rising with the frantic energy of people who believed they had finally arrived. I played my part, offering suggestions on the catering and the champagne, my expressions practiced and hollow. While they obsessed over the menu, I retreated to the guest bathroom to finalize the last of the coordination. I sent a single, encrypted message to my attorney. The timeline was set for the party's peak. He confirmed the arrival of the auditor and the process servers. I returned to the living room, finding David adjusting his tie in the mirror, his reflection radiating a smug, unearned confidence. He asked me if I was excited for the night. I told him it would be a night he would never forget. He laughed, oblivious to the double meaning. The rooftop venue hummed with the vibration of the city below. Thousands of lights stretched toward the horizon, a grid of electricity that mirrored the complexity of the code they thought they had stolen. Beatrice stood near the glass railing, her gaze fixed on the skyline as if she were already calculating the value of the buildings she could see. Chloe paced the perimeter, her phone pressed to her ear, finalizing the details of the buyout with a voice that carried the sharp edge of triumph. David moved through the space with a glass in his hand, greeting guests with a wide, effortless smile that never reached his eyes. He stopped beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder, his touch light and possessive. He leaned in to whisper about the future, about the scale of the company, and about how far they had come in such a short time. I nodded, my face a mask of quiet support, while I watched the elevator indicator. The family was at the zenith of their ambition, surrounded by the trappings of a success that was entirely borrowed. They were waiting for the celebration to begin, unaware that the stage had become their cage. Champagne corks popped in rapid succession, the sound sharp against the ambient hum of the city. Waiters moved through the crowd with silver trays, but the center of gravity remained fixed on Chloe. She stood on a small dais, a glass raised high, her voice cutting through the chatter with practiced authority. She spoke of vision, of disruption, and of the genius required to build an empire from nothing. Her words were hollow, a performance of innovation built on stolen foundations. Beatrice watched from the front row, nodding with a satisfied, predatory grace, while David stood by her side, his eyes scanning the room for validation. I stayed in the shadows near the bar, my fingers tracing the cold glass of my own untouched drink. I checked my watch. The minute hand clicked forward, closing the final gap. Chloe finished her toast. The crowd erupted in applause, and the sound of their laughter filled the glass enclosure. They were drunk on their own narrative, completely blind to the reality of their position. I kept my expression neutral, a mirror reflecting nothing, while I tracked the movement of the elevator indicator. The party was at its loudest, the hubris at its thickest, and the silence I had cultivated for 18 months was about to be shattered. The laughter was still echoing off the glass walls when the elevator indicator blinked. A soft metallic chime cut through the room, barely audible, yet it acted like a physical barrier. The conversation near the entrance faltered. I watched the doors slide open with the slow, deliberate precision of a guillotine. Two figures stepped out into the bright, artificial light of the rooftop. My attorney moved first, his posture rigid, clutching a leather briefcase. Beside him, the auditor walked with a steady, clinical pace, scanning the room as if he were checking a ledger. They did not look like guests. Their arrival acted like a vacuum, pulling the warmth out of the air. Beatrice turned, her smile freezing as she registered the unfamiliar faces. Chloe stopped mid-sentence, her glass hovering. David looked toward the elevator, his brow furrowing. The celebratory hum changed, curdling into a jagged, uncertain silence. The music died, not with a fade, but with an abrupt, jarring silence that left the guests blinking in the sudden vacuum. Every eye in the room tracked the two men as they navigated the crowd. They moved with a singular, focused intent, ignoring the confused murmurs and the nervous shifting of the socialites. The lead representative from the acquiring firm stood by the bar, his drink forgotten in his hand. My auditor reached him first. He did not offer a greeting. He simply reached into his briefcase and produced a thick, bound document. He held it out, his hand steady, his expression devoid of any social pleasantry. The representative took the folder, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before he pulled it open. Around them, the silence deepened, turning heavy and suffocating. Beatrice stepped forward, her mouth opening to demand an explanation, but the sight of the official seal on the document stopped her cold. Chloe remained frozen on the dais. The auditor spoke, his voice low, but carrying clearly, announcing the formal notice of a breach of provenance. The air in the room felt thin, charged with the undeniable weight of a collapsing empire. The representative read the first page, his eyes darting across the text. He stopped, his face draining of color, and looked up at the auditor. He didn't speak, but he signaled his assistant with a sharp, frantic gesture. The buyout was suspended. The words hung in the air, cold and absolute. The representative turned toward the crowd, his voice tight, as he announced that the transaction was halted indefinitely pending an investigation. A ripple of shock tore through the room. Chloe's face went white, her skin losing its luster under the harsh overhead lights. She dropped her glass. It shattered against the marble floor, the sound sharp as a gunshot. The guests retreated, creating a wide, empty circle around the family. Beatrice clutched the edge of a nearby table, her knuckles white, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. David stood paralyzed, his eyes darting between the auditor and the door, searching for an exit that didn't exist. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The empire they had built was not just failing, it was being dismantled in real time. I stepped out from the shadows of the balcony, the city skyline glowing behind me like a backdrop for a funeral. The crowd parted, not out of respect, but out of a sudden, instinctive need to distance themselves from the wreckage. I walked toward the center of the room, my heels clicking against the marble floor with a steady, rhythmic precision that cut through the frantic murmurs. Every step was a deliberate reclamation of the space they had occupied for so long. I reached the dais, the light catching the sharp edges of the architecture, and stopped. I looked at Beatrice, whose hands were trembling as she gripped her handbag. I looked at Chloe, who was staring at me as if I were a ghost. Finally, I turned my gaze to David. He stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. I did not rush. I took a breath, letting the cold air of the room settle into my lungs, and looked out over the sea of faces. The silence was absolute now, a vacuum waiting to be filled. I leaned into the space, my voice steady and clear, and began to explain the breach of provenance. I signaled the auditor. He tapped a command into his tablet, and the massive screen behind me flickered to life. A cascade of green text began to scroll. 18 months of hidden data transfers, time-stamped and verified. I pointed to the first entry, a ghost process that had siphoned my core algorithms into a shell company. The room went deathly quiet as the names and account numbers appeared on the wall. I detailed the path, the encrypted exfiltration, the commit logs, and the final destination in Chloe's private ledger. Every line of code was a fingerprint. I walked the room through the timeline of the theft, showing how David had redirected payments while claiming the system was failing. I highlighted the specific packets that proved his direct involvement, showing the exact moments he had bypassed my security protocols. The evidence was undeniable. It was a map of their greed, laid bare for every investor and peer to see. My attorney stepped forward and handed the formal notice to the lead representative of the acquiring firm. The man scanned the document, his brow furrowing as he reached the final paragraph. He looked up, signaled his team, and the buyout process halted instantly. I watched the screen as the status of the acquisition shifted from pending to suspended. Then I triggered the final command. The reversion clause activated. Across the room, phones began to buzz and ping in a discordant chorus. Chloe checked her device, her face draining of color as she refreshed the screen. The accounts were locked. I turned to the auditor, who nodded once, confirming the transfer. Every asset tied to the stolen algorithms was now legally mine. The gilded cage they had built was no longer theirs to inhabit. I watched David reach for his phone, only to find his access denied. The silence in the room deepened, heavy with the weight of their sudden, total dispossession. They stood in the center of their own party, surrounded by the trappings of wealth. The legal architecture I had buried in the contract was now the iron walls surrounding them. They had signed the papers, and now they were living the consequences. Beatrice was the first to break. Her phone vibrated against the marble table, a relentless sequence of alerts. She picked it up, her thumb swiping with practiced arrogance, but the movement slowed as she read the first notification, a foreclosure notice for the estate. She tapped the screen, her brow knitting in confusion. Then she opened her banking app. The balance read 0. She tried to refresh the page, but the app force closed. She dialed her private banker, holding the phone to her ear with a hand that had started to tremor. The line clicked. An automated voice informed her that her accounts were under a court-ordered hold due to a breach of provenance. She pulled the phone away, staring at the screen as if it had betrayed her. The poise she had maintained throughout the night fractured. She looked toward the elevators, then back at me, her eyes wide with the sudden, sharp realization that her status had been liquidated. She reached for the table to steady herself, her fingers scraping against the polished stone. Chloe was still trying to salvage the narrative. She tapped furiously at her tablet, drafting a statement to the press, her face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screen. She didn't notice the notifications flooding in until the room grew quiet. The news of the lawsuit had hit the wire. Her name was no longer associated with innovation. It was linked to the term intellectual property theft in every major tech headline. She refreshed her feed, watching as the imaginary tags were replaced by accusations of fraud. She tried to post a rebuttal, but the platform flagged her account. A journalist from a major tech publication walked toward her, phone held high, recording the scene. He didn't ask for a quote. He read the court filing aloud. Chloe stood frozen, her fingers hovering over the glass, unable to delete the evidence that was now being shared by thousands. The brand she had spent years curating was incinerated in minutes. She looked at the crowd, expecting support, but found only cameras and cold, recording eyes. She dropped the tablet onto the table, the screen cracking under the impact, as the reality of her public disgrace settled in. She was a cautionary tale. David was the last to understand, and the slowest to accept the shift in power. He moved toward me, his steps uneven, his smile flickering like a dying bulb. He reached out, his hand hovering near my arm, but he stepped back, leaving his fingers grasping at empty air. His composure, once his most effective tool, dissolved into a series of jagged, nervous movements. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, coming out as a strained, incoherent whisper. His hands began to shake, the tremors traveling from his wrists up to his shoulders, making his posture slump. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, but Beatrice was occupied with her own ruin, and Chloe was already being ignored by the crowd. He turned back to me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, the reality of his total financial and social erasure finally settling into his features. He wiped sweat from his forehead, his skin pale and clammy under the bright party lights. Every attempt he made to project authority only highlighted his fragility. He fumbled with his collar, gasping for air as the silence of the room pressed in on him, leaving him nowhere to hide from the consequences he had signed into existence. I pulled a thick, bound folder from my briefcase and held it out. David hesitated, his gaze darting between my face and the document. He reached out, his fingers fumbling with the heavy paper stock. As he opened the folder, the first page was the divorce petition, but it was the second page that stopped his breath. I pointed to the bottom of the debt allocation document. His signature was there, clear and permanent, dated 18 months prior. He traced the ink with a shaking finger, his eyes scanning the clauses he had once dismissed as standard boilerplate. The cross-collateralization terms were highlighted in red, detailing how every asset he had claimed as his own was now legally bound to my ownership. He looked up, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound emerged. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had not just been stealing, he had been building the very cage that now held him. He flipped through the pages, seeing the itemized list of every property. He looked at me, searching for a loophole, a sign of mercy, but found only the cold, precise reality of his own greed reflected back at him. I turned my back on them. The party continued. A dull roar of voices that no longer had any claim on my attention. I walked past the glass walls, the city lights blurring into long, white streaks of movement. Every step felt lighter, the tension that had defined my life for 18 months evaporating with each movement toward the exit. I reached the elevator bank and pressed the call button. The chime was sharp, clean, and final. I glanced back one last time. Beatrice was slumped in a chair, her hands covering her face. Chloe was shouting at a lawyer who was already walking away. David remained frozen, staring at the floor, the papers still clutched in his white-knuckled grip. The elevator doors slid open with a smooth, mechanical hiss. I stepped inside. The interior was cool, smelling of ozone and polished steel. As the doors began to close, I watched the gap narrow, cutting off the sight of their ruin. The world outside fell away, replaced by the soft hum of the lift descending. The descent was smooth, a silent drop through the heart of the city. I watched the floor numbers tick down, each one a marker of distance from the life I had reclaimed. There was no triumph in the moment, only a profound, quiet clarity. They had built something impressive, but they had forgotten the most important rule of the game. You never steal from the person who wrote the rules. I reached the lobby, the air cool and smelling of rain. The automatic doors parted, and I stepped out onto the sidewalk. The city was vast, indifferent, and entirely open. I walked toward the corner, my pace steady, leaving the weight of the last 18 months behind. I did not look back. The streetlight stretched out before me, a grid of possibilities that were finally, once again, mine to define. I took a deep breath of the night air, felt the pulse of the city against my skin, and kept moving. The trap was sprung, the debt was settled, and the silence was no longer a cage. It was a blank page.